Hi, I'm Olivia from Classroom 42, and today we're doing a full exam walkthrough for AQA GCSE History Paper 1A. In this video, we'll be doing an exam overview, a walkthrough of each question type, showing you some grade 9 example answers, and giving you some exam questions for you to try at the end as well. Okay, so your Paper 1 is split into two sections. Section A is focusing on your period studies, which is what we'll be looking at in today's video, and Section B looks at your wider world studies, which we'll look at in a separate video. Your period studies topics will either be America, 1840 to 1895, Germany, 1890 to 1945, Russia, 1894 to 1945, or America, 1920, depending on what your school studies. For Paper 1, so this is sections A and B, it is a written exam and is 2 hours long. It is 84 marks in total and it makes up 50% of your history GCSE. So let's take a look at the exam overview for Paper 1, Section A. So there's 6 different exam questions within this exam paper. Your first question looks at how do the interpretations differ, and that is a 4-mark question. Your second question looks at why do the interpretations differ, which is a 4-mark question again. Your question 3 will look at which interpretation is more convincing, and that is worth 8 marks. Your question 4 is a describe question, which is worth 4 marks. Your question 5 is an in what ways question, which is worth 8 marks. And your final question is an essay question, which is worth 12 marks. So let's take a look at these question types in a bit more detail. So for your questions 1, 2 and 3 within Paper 1 Section A, we'll all look at 2 interpretations that will focus on a specific theme or topic within your topic that you study. So your question 1 will look at how do the interpretations differ. So it's asking you to identify differences between the interpretations. So for this question, it's only worth 4 marks, so you just need one clear and concise paragraph. For example, you could structure your answer as follows. Stating your argument, so the main difference between interpretation A and interpretation B is. Then explain interpretation A, identifying its view on the topic and explaining how you know this using details from the interpretation, so you can either use quotes or paraphrasing, and then doing the same exact thing for interpretation B. So let's take a look at an example question for this question type. So our question is, how does interpretation B differ from interpretation A about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany? Explain your answer based on what it says in interpretations A and B. So you can see here we've got our 2 interpretations. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a bit of a closer look at them. So yeah, your interpretations for Paper 1A question 1 will always be 2 written interpretations. And the interpretations will always be from an author writing after the event or time period that you're looking at. So your sources, which you'll look at in other sections and other papers, look more at, they will have been written or published at the time of the event happening, whereas your interpretations will be looking at the event, it will have been published kind of after the events happened. So you can see here in this question, our topic or theme is the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany. So that is what our focus is for questions 1, 2 and 3 for this section. And we'll be looking at these 2 specific interpretations for questions 1, 2 and 3 again. So interpretation A is from McKee's autobiography, published in 1960, and McKee was a member of the German League of Girls, so she had first-hand experience with what it was like living in Nazi Germany. And her interpretation talks just about how girls were often, prepared for motherhood from quite an early age, and their kind of most important job really in Nazi Germany, they were told at least, was to become a mother and to bear children. Then interpretation B is an excerpt from Katrine Clay's book, Trautmann's Journey, and this looks at the story of a famous goalkeeper, Bert Trautmann. And this interpretation talks about how Trautmann was really excited to join Hitler Youth, and he was really proud to be, in his uniform and to be swearing loyalty to Hitler. So let's have a look at our example answer for this question. So you can see here we've just got one paragraph that focuses both on interpretation A and interpretation B. So the first thing you always need to do in your paragraph is just to state your argument or your point. So we have just stated the interpretations differ because they show the positive and negative experiences of young people in Nazi Germany. So that's our difference that we have identified. Then we need to identify a detail in interpretation A that shows kind of this difference. So again, you can either use paraphrasing or you can use quotes, like we've got a quote in here. So we're talking about how interpretation A focuses on the negative experiences of youth in Nazi Germany, writing that young girls were indoctrinated by the Nazis to prepare for motherhood and that it was their duty to breed. Then we just need to explain this detail. So this suggests that young girls had poor experiences with Nazi Germany as they were pressured into having children at a young age, which often led to illegitimate children. Then we just need to do the same for interpretation B. So alternatively, interpretation B focuses on the positive experiences of youth in Nazi Germany, writing that the young boy was part of Hitler Youth and wore his uniform with intense pride. Then we of course have to explain this detail. So this suggests that young people instead had a positive experience with Nazi Germany and the Hitler Youth represented an opportunity to show loyalty to the regime. And that's our question 1 done. Okay, so for question 2. So in question 1, we were asked to basically identify a difference between the interpretations, whereas question 2 is asking us why the interpretations differ. So we're looking more at the authors and their background and kind of why they might write different things about that topic. So once again, this question is worth 4 marks, so we need one clear and concise paragraph focusing on both the interpretations. For this question, you should identify a reason for difference. Identify differences in the interpretation's provenance. So the provenance is the bit of text at the top of the interpretation, which basically just gives us a little bit more detail about the author, when it was published, what the kind of interpretation is, like where it's from, and it might give us a little bit of context about the author's background or what their sort of views are. And then finally, we need to explain why these cause differences in views. So there's lots of different reasons why interpretations might differ, and I've listed a few different reasons here. So the first thing to consider is the author's background, beliefs, location, and time of writing. So you want to think about what information was available to them. So for example, if you're looking at an interpretation that was written by an historian who perhaps wasn't, around during the time of the event that they're talking about, but they perhaps have access to a lot of different sources and a lot of different sort of different interpretations that they can use to create their own interpretation. They might be giving a more objective sort of interpretation compared to someone, for example, who experienced the event themselves and perhaps has a bit more of a personal connection to the event. So their opinion or their interpretation is going to be more opinion and more about their own experience. The next thing we need to think about is what form is the interpretation. So whether it's a newspaper, a journal, a speech, there's all sorts of different kind of ways an interpretation can be. And we got to think about who was the intended audience and what purpose were they writing for. So for example, a newspaper article could be more sensationalized, or they might overemphasize on kind of what actually happened because they're writing to entertain or to sell copies of the newspaper, and the purpose is to sell their newspaper. Whereas perhaps a journal entry might be a little bit more true to actually what happened because the author is just writing it for themselves. The next thing we can think about is that authors may have chosen to place emphasis on different factors, which can lead to differences. And also authors may have different perspectives, approaches, and focuses. Again, it might lead to differences in interpretations. So let's have a look at an example answer. So our question is, why might the authors of interpretation A and B, so we're still looking at the interpretations that we looked at in question 1, why might the authors of interpretation A and B have a different interpretation about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany? Explain your answer using interpretations A and B and your contextual knowledge. So here is our example answer. So we've just got one paragraph focusing on both the interpretations. So first of all, we have to identify a reason for difference. So here we've identified that their interpretations might be different due to their different backgrounds. Then we've got to look at the provenance of interpretation A. So interpretation A is from McKee's autobiography. As a former member of the German League of Girls, McKee provides a personal account. And then we need to explain why this might lead to differences. So her perspective is shaped by her own negative experiences and emotions growing up in Germany, which allowed her to reflect critically on the pressures placed on young girls. And then we've got to do the same for interpretation B. So we're looking at the provenance again of interpretation B. So in contrast, interpretation B, written by Katrine Clay in 2010, tells the story of Bert Trautmann, a member of the Hitler Youth. Clay's perspective is based on her research and the broader story of Trautmann's life. And then we've got to explain why this might affect her interpretation. So as a historian writing many years later, Clay might have had access to more sources and a more objective perspective because she did not have first-hand experience herself. And that is question 2. Okay, and then question 3, so this is the final question where we're looking at our interpretations. And this question is asking us which interpretation is more convincing. And this is an 8-mark question. So for this question, you're required to use both interpretations and your knowledge of historical context. So it's really important that you don't just rely on the contents of the interpretations, you do also need to bring in your historical context as well. So for this question, you could structure it as follows. So you could do 1 paragraph on interpretation A, 1 paragraph on interpretation B, and then do a conclusion to kind of sum up your evaluation. So remember, so this question is asking us what we think, so it's asking us which interpretation is more convincing. So for this question, you do need to bring in your own judgment and talk about, which one you think is more convincing. So your answer could be evaluation of interpretation A, with a appeal paragraph. So we could state the view of interpretation A about the specific topic in the question. Then we need to identify specific details in the interpretation that convey this view. So whether that's paraphrasing or quotations. Then we need to explain how these details are supported and or contradicted by your historical knowledge. So a great way to bring in your historical knowledge is to use it to explain which one is more convincing. So we can say, for example, this interpretation is convincing because it aligns with my historical knowledge, and then bring in your historical knowledge. Or you can say, perhaps this interpretation is not quite so convincing because I know this, and this, and that contradicts with the interpretation. And then finally, we need to link back to the question. So based on your analysis, are you convinced by this interpretation? Then we need to do the exact same for interpretation B, but in this link, we can also compare it to the other interpretation. So we can say, interpretation B is convincing, however, I think the interpretation A is more convincing because, or vice versa. And then finally, we just need a conclusion to briefly sum up which interpretation you think is more convincing and why. And this just really shows the examiner that you've come to a sustained conclusion and that you have a judgment and you're, really focusing on the question. Okay, so let's look at our example question and answer. So our question is, which interpretation gives the more convincing opinion about the experiences of young people living in Nazi Germany? Explain your answer based on your contextual knowledge and what it says in interpretations A and B. So you can see here that we need to include the contents of interpretations A and B, but we also need to bring in our contextual knowledge. So here is an example answer. So we've got 3 paragraphs. We've got a paragraph on interpretation A, a paragraph on interpretation B, and then our short conclusion at the end. So first of all, we are giving our point. So interpretation A gives the more convincing opinion. So feel free, if you have already decided, feel free to just go in with your first sentence to which one is more convincing. It's great to sort of really show the examiner what your judgment is, and if you keep reiterating it throughout your answer, you'll show that you've come to, a justified judgment, and that even though you've compared both of the interpretations, you still think that one of them is more convincing than the other. I would also always recommend that you do come to the conclusion that one is more convincing than the other. Obviously, in some cases, they might sort of be of similar levels of convincing to you, but just for the purposes of answering the question, it's a lot easier for the examiner to know whether you've come to a judgment if you give a really clear and distinct judgment about, I think this one, source A is more convincing. Whereas if you're a bit more wishy-washy, it's a bit harder for the examiner to know whether you've come to a sustained judgment, and it can get a bit confusing with your explanation. So yeah, I would suggest just picking one of the interpretations and saying that one is more convincing. It doesn't mean that the other one is not convincing at all, but it just means that one of the interpretations is more convincing than the other. So after we have given our point, then we need to add our evidence. So this is evidence from the interpretation. So this might be quotes or paraphrasing of what the interpretation says. So For this point, we're just talking about how this is shown in Mickey's account, where she recalls that girls were taught from an early age that motherhood was their patriotic duty to the Reich, and how girls felt that they were serving their country by becoming mothers. Then we're going to explain why. To explain why this makes the interpretation convincing. So this is where we can bring in our own historical knowledge. So you can see here, I've said this interpretation is supported by wider historical knowledge. And then I've given my historical knowledge. So we talked about how the Nazi regime placed a huge emphasis on increasing the birth rate. We've also talked about the League of German Maidens and Hitler Youth training girls in domestic skills like cooking, sewing and childcare. We've also talked about the 3Ks, children, church and kitchen, reinforcing the idea that the woman's role was to support the family and raise strong Nazi children. And then we just need to make sure that we link back to the question to make sure that we are talking about the interpretations and which is more convincing. So, therefore, interpretation A is convincing because it demonstrates the Nazi goal of shaping girls into ideal mothers for the future of Nazi Germany. Okay, and then we just need to do the exact same for interpretation B. So you can see here we have added in our point. So in contrast, interpretation B presents a more individual and positive view. Then we are giving our evidence. So this is quotes or paraphrasing from the interpretation about what the contents of the interpretation is. So talking about Trautmann's personal excitement about wearing the uniform and swearing loyalty to Hitler, and how Hitler Youth was, an opportunity for adventure and honour. Then we are explaining it. So for this one, because I have already stated, interpretation A is the one that I think is more convincing. So this is a great way to show how the other interpretation is perhaps not so convincing. So we've said our historical knowledge that does align with the interpretation. So this was true for some boys, especially early on, as the Hitler Youth offered activities like camping and sports and helped boys feel part of something important. But then we can show perhaps why the interpretation isn't quite as convincing as interpretation A. So, however, the interpretation doesn't mention resistance groups like the Edelweiss Pirates, who often beat up members of the Hitler Youth and rebelled against the Nazi regime. So it does not represent the experiences of other youths in Germany. So here we're showing that although, the interpretation is still convincing to an extent, it's not quite as convincing as interpretation A because it doesn't show the wider experiences of youth in Germany. It only shows quite a small select few group of boys who perhaps were quite indoctrinated in the Nazi regime and were happy and excited to join things like Hitler Youth, but it doesn't show, for example, the resistance group. So it's a great way to kind of bring in more historical knowledge by saying perhaps why the interpretation isn't as convincing. And then, of course, we're finishing off it with a link back to the question. Therefore, I do not find interpretation B convincing because it presents a narrow view and doesn't show the wider variety of experiences young people had under the Nazis. So we're just linking it back to the question again about which one we find more convincing. And then in our conclusion, we can just compare the two different interpretations. So we can talk about which one is more convincing. So interpretation A is the more convincing interpretation because it provides a broader insight into the experiences of young girls in Nazi Germany, reflecting the extensive indoctrination and social pressures placed on them to serve the state throughout motherhood, whereas interpretation B only focuses on the positive experience of the minority. So here we're just stating once again which of the interpretations we find more convincing and why. Okay, so that is all of the interpretation questions. So now we're on to our questions that just focus on the content of your unit. So question 4 is a describe to question, and it is worth 4 marks. So this question will normally ask you to describe 2 problems, usually faced by an individual or a group of people. So for example, it might be women, it could be Black Americans, or it could be a bit more broad and just say, people living in the USSR or Americans in general. But yeah, it will ask you to describe usually 2 problems faced by those people in a particular time period or particular theme within your topic. So to achieve 4 marks for this question, you need to identify 1 valid problem. That'll get you 1 mark. Then you need to describe this problem by giving supporting contextual evidence. That'll give you another mark. And you just need to do that twice. So you've got 2 problems and 2 lots of supporting evidence. So for example, if you're asked to identify 2 problems people faced during a specific event or time period, you should identify a problem they faced and explain why this problem impacted their lives using historical knowledge to back up your claims, and just do that twice. So here is our example question. So this question is asking us to describe two problems faced by the Weimar government during political unrest between 1919 and 1923. So you can see here our kind of group of people is the Weimar government, and the kind of topic or event taking place was during the political unrest, and we've got some dates there as well. So we need to make sure that the problems that we are looking at are in between those dates. So you can see here, this is my example answer. I've split it up into two paragraphs just to show the different problems, but obviously you can just keep it into one paragraph if you'd prefer. So first of all, we are identifying our first problem. So our first problem is the threat of left-wing uprisings, such as the Spartacist uprising. Then we just need to describe the problem. So this revolt aimed to overthrow the government and establish a communist regime, and the government had to rely on the Freikorps to suppress the uprising. So we're explaining or describing how this was a problem for our particular group, so for the Weimar government. So we want to make sure if they're specifying a particular group of people, we are focusing on that particular group. Okay, so then we just need to do that again. So we're identifying a second problem. So another problem was the challenge from right-wing groups, notably during the Kapp Putsch. And then we just need to describe this problem and how it was a problem for the Weimar government. So Wolfgang Kapp and the Freikorps attempted to seize control of Berlin and overthrow the government. This exposed the government's vulnerability and lack of control. And that is 4 out of 4 marks. Okay, so for question 5, this question will ask in what ways were the lives affected? And this is an 8-mark question. So this question will look at a group of people, so it will ask you in what ways were the lives of, for example, German people affected by, and then a particular topic or event or theme within your unit. And this is worth 8 marks. So this question requires you to write about change. So you should identify 2 or more ways the lives of people were affected and explain them using a range of historical knowledge. So for this question, I would suggest doing 2 Peel paragraphs to make sure that you hit all of the mark scheme criteria. And to do this, you just need to do your point. So for example, one way in which the group's lives were affected by the event in the question is, and state your point. Then you need to provide your evidence, so providing relevant and precise historical evidence. So as always, stats, places, names, events, dates, all of that kind of good stuff. Then you need to explain, so using the evidence, explain why this change impacted people's lives. So you need to make sure that you're really focusing on the question and focusing on the group of people within the question, as well as the event or kind of topic within the question. And then finally, we need to link back to the question. So therefore, the group's lives are affected by the event in the question because, and sum up your point. So here is an example question. So in this question we asked, in what ways were the lives of young people affected by the Nazi regime? So you can see here our group of people are young people and the topic or event in question is the Nazi regime. So here is our example answer. So we've got 2 paragraphs, each on a different way in which the young people's lives were affected by the Nazi regime. For this question, you don't really need to do an introduction or a conclusion because you're not really evaluating anything. You're just sort of explaining how lives of people were affected. So first of all, we need to state our point. So firstly, the lives of young people were affected by the Nazi regime because the Nazis controlled their education. So that's our first main point, is education. Then we want to bring in our historical evidence. So bringing in lots of context to education in the Nazi regime. So we're talking about how schools were required to teach subjects in certain ways, particularly in history and biology. We're talking about radical theories, how Jewish students were segregated or expelled and anti-Semitic ideas were taught, and the fact that teachers who did not comply with the curriculum risked losing their jobs. Then we need to explain how this affected the lives of young people. So we're just explaining this restructuring of education indoctrinated young people with loyalty to the Nazi state, reducing their exposure to differing ideas and discouraging independent thought. And then finally, we just need to link back to the question. Therefore, the lives of young people were affected by the Nazi regime because their education completely changed to fit with the Nazi ideals. And that's our first paragraph. And then we just need to do the same again for our other point. So our second point is talking about youth groups, so Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. Next, obviously, we need to do our evidence, just like we have in the first paragraph. So we're talking about the organisations, what they did, so how boys were trained in marching and map reading, women were focused on domestic skills and fitness for childbearing, and how these groups also served as tools for surveillance. Then we're going to explain how this affected the lives of young people. So this intense involvement in Nazi organisations left young people with little time for the other activities or influences, deeply embedding Nazi beliefs and loyalty to Hitler in their daily lives and limiting their freedom to develop independently. And finally, we're just going to link back to the question. Therefore, the lives of young people were affected by the Nazi regime because they had to attend youth groups that further indoctrinated them with Nazi ideology. And that's how to answer question 5. Okay, so now we are on question 6, which is the final question within paper 1, section A. So this question is our essay question, and it will ask us which of the following, and it's worth 12 marks. So this question basically asks us to make a judgment between 2 bullet points in relation to a particular topic. So it will ask us which of the following was the more important reason for, or the biggest consequence of, or one of our second order concepts. And it'll give us 2 bullet points, and we have to make a judgment between which of those bullet points was more important for the topic in the question. So you could structure your answer as follows. So I would suggest doing 2 Peel paragraphs and a conclusion at the end. So your first paragraph needs to evaluate your first bullet point. So obviously you need to state your point. Then you give your evidence, so providing relevant historical evidence. So lots and lots of, as usual, stats, places, names, events, dates. And then explain, so using the evidence, explain to what extent this point promoted change or causation or consequence, whatever is the question is asking you. And then all you need to do is link back to the question. So based on your analysis, how important is this point? Then you need to do the exact same for the second bullet point, but in your link, you can also kind of compare it to your first point. So you can say, I think, although this point was important, I think that, the point before, point 1, was more important because without point 1, this wouldn't have happened, or, point 1 on its own wouldn't have been enough to do X, Y, Z. So you can kind of compare the 2 points as well and kind of make a judgment within your second bullet point. And then you just need to do your conclusion. So this will be a brief summary of your judgment. Again, just so the examiner is finishing and they know exactly what your judgment is, exactly what you're arguing, and they know you've come to a sustained judgment throughout your answer. As I mentioned, you may wish to explain the relationship between both points to make your argument about which is more significant. So for our example question, our question is asking us which of the following was the more important reason why Hitler was able to form a dictatorship? And we've got the Enabling Act and elimination of opposition. So here we're talking about the most important reason as to why Hitler was able to form a dictatorship. We've got to make sure that we include both of these bullet points in our answer. So here is our answer. So we've got 1 paragraph on the first bullet point, 1 paragraph on the second bullet point, and our conclusion. For this question, you don't really need to write an introduction, so you can just go straight into your 2 main paragraphs. So first of all, we are stating our first point. So an important reason why Hitler was able to form a dictatorship was the passing of the Enabling Act. Then we need to give our evidence. This is historical context about that particular point. So we're talking about how the Enabling Act gave Hitler the legal power to pass laws without needing the Reichstag's approval for 4 years, ending parliamentary democracy, and talking about how Hitler used the essay to intimidate opponents. And then we need to explain why this was an important reason for Hitler to form a dictatorship. So how did this allow Hitler to form a dictatorship? So with these new powers, Hitler could legally introduce laws that helped consolidate his control, such as banning other political parties, removing civil liberties, and establishing the Gestapo. We're also talking about how the Act allowed Hitler to rule by decree, marginalising President Hindenburg and destroying the Weimar Constitution. That's our explanation. And then all we need to do is, as always, link it back to the question. So because this is an evaluation question, it's asking us which was more important, we need to state whether it was important or not. So therefore, the Enabling Act was extremely important because it legally removed democratic checks on Hitler's power and allowed him to create the framework for totalitarian rule. So there's our link back to the question. Then we need to do the same for the second bullet point. So we're stating our points. This time we're talking about the removal of opposition. Then we're giving lots of evidence about the removal of opposition. So we're talking about the Night of the Long Knives. We're talking about Hitler banning political parties apart from the Nazis, abolishing the trade unions and using violence and fear and all of that evidence. Then again, we need to explain why this was an important reason why Hitler was able to form a dictatorship. So we're talking about how the elimination of opposition was crucial because it meant that there were no remaining organised groups that could challenge Hitler. And then we need to link it back to the question. So and this is where we can compare both of the bullet points as well. So was this point more important than our first point? So, however, this would not have been possible without the powers granted by the Enabling Act. So that's what our first bullet point is, which allowed Hitler to carry out many of these actions legally. Therefore, while the elimination of opposition was highly significant, it was made possible by the legal powers granted through the Enabling Act, making that the more important factor overall. So, although we're still kind of, showing that both of the points were important, we're showing that the one point was more important. And again, as I always say, it's always good to make sure that you do have an opinion and that you do say that one was more important than the other, as it just means that the examiner really knows that you've come to a judgment and that, it's not wishy-washy and you're not saying that they were kind of equally important or that kind of thing. It's really good to have even though both of them were important, this point was the most important. And then finally, we just need to link back to the question in our conclusion. So we can compare both here. So in conclusion, both the Enabling Act and the elimination of opposition were vital in Hitler's creation of dictatorship. However, the Enabling Act was more important because it gave Hitler the legal authority to remove opposition, ban political parties, and control the country by decree. So we're just showing how the Enabling Act was without the Enabling Act, perhaps the elimination of opposition wouldn't have been so easy for Hitler. And that is question 6. Okay, so that is all of the questions within Paper 1, Section A. So now it is your turn. So I will link below some of our 12-mark questions that focus on all of the different period studies topics, and you can get instant AI marks and feedback for those questions so you can see exactly how you've done right away. But yeah, good luck with your revision, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!